All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Well, good afternoon out in Toronto, I suppose. Good morning out west. The CLF Toronto is a local hub of the Carbon Leadership Forum. We organize events to empower industry professionals to radically reduce embodied carbon from buildings and infrastructure. We are one of over 30 local hubs across the world. Three other local hubs currently exist in Canada in Vancouver, Ottawa, and Calgary. If you'd like to hear about our events and stay in touch, please visit our website at clftoronto.com and sign up to our mailing list. As a Toronto-based group, we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is in the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We're really thrilled to have these speakers here today representing two really truly Canadian practices working across the country. I'm going to do a brief introduction here into our speakers, and then I'll kind of let them take it away. So starting us off today is going to be Jen Hancock, who's the Vice President of Collaborative Construction at Chandos. Jen has worked at Chandos for over 15 years and has helped lead many of the company's innovative practices in that time. And she's worked on a number of IPD projects in Canada and has been a key champion in bringing this across the country from BC to Ontario. Jen is also on the board of directors and committee chair with the Integrated Project Delivery Alliance and is on the board of directors for the Edmonton Construction Association and the Alberta Construction Association. Joining us from Ellis Dawn is Denise Van Opbergen, who's a manager of corporate sustainability. Denise works on identifying and reducing emissions across the company's focus areas, which includes their own operations, the materials procured, and the operations of the projects built. And then finally, Mark Galeone is the director of Building and Material Sciences at Ellis Dawn. Trained as an engineer, Mark spent his early career in private real estate development, and now with Ellis Dawn, he leads the Building and Material Sciences team, where he is focused on accelerating the adoption of emerging construction technologies and supporting construction operations nationally. Mark has played a central role, as many of you probably know, in the proliferation of mass timber within Ellis Dawn and is passionate about low carbon building solutions. We've pulled this panel together really to start talking about something we don't talk about enough, which is the role of embodied carbon within the construction industry, and in particular, in this case, from the contractor's perspective. I think this is a conversation which is, or a piece of development within each practice at various levels of development. And Chandos and Ellis Dawn have kind of, I think, jumped ahead a little bit in some of this, and we're going to hear a little bit about their processes. What has motivated them to do this, some early lessons learned, and especially some of the pain endured, I think. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand this over to Jen, maybe to get us started. So we're going to do two brief presentations, and then we're going to invite our viewers to engage in this conversation through questions. There's a little bit of housekeeping here, so we're going to invite the questions in the Zoom chat. We recommend using speaker view when watching this. We ask you to turn off your audio and video just to sort of help with the bandwidth here. And then just a final note that the session is being recorded and will be shared on our website right after. All right, thank you.
Great, thanks, Alistair.
You're welcome.
I will share my screen here. Okay, so just getting going, assuming, Alistair, you can see my screen. I assume you can give me thumbs up. Oh, good enough. Mark, okay, perfect, thanks.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So yeah, I'll just kind of get started a little bit about where we kind of came from on the embodied carbon. It's pretty fresh for us. It's been a focus that we've included really only in the last year. So we're kind of on the emerging part of our journey there. Still incoming. So one of the things that might help explain a bit about where some of the motivation for us, 6 years ago, we decided to certify as a B Corp. So we actually we went down the path and said, hey, do we think that we could make this? We went through the application process, looked at it, and certified in 2016. It was a really great exercise. I mean, for anyone who, I assume most people are familiar with B Corp, but if you're not, it's kind of sort of like a lead rating, but for a company. It analyzes things like, looks at your, like how you interact with community, your governance, your workers, how you treat workers. It also looks at things like your sustainability measures. And so what was really great for us is that, what B Corp did, and so this kind of relates into how where we are now on the embodied carbon side, but it points out some areas where you're really strong, but it also points out areas where you may have some gaps in, governance, management, just direction you're going. And so, we had some strength in the sustainability space, but there were some clear gaps. 6 years ago, we weren't tracking greenhouse gas emissions. We were doing waste diversion on most of our job sites at that point already. We had some green plans happening within our offices, but outside of that, it wasn't, we weren't doing, we had room to grow and change. So being a B Corp has certainly heightened our awareness of spaces where we have gaps and where we could improve. So that's, something. So taking something from Yvonne Chouinard, who was the founder of Patagonia and, really an incredible leader in the sustainability space. To do good, you actually have to do something. And so, sometimes, from my perspective, this means that sometimes you do stuff, but you may not have all the details worked out. It's about taking steps forward and making progress. And the world that we all work and live in is quite complex. The building industry and design industry, it's very much changing all the time. There's new technologies happening. We're seeing, changes in products and materials. And so, how do you move forward with all of that constant kind of flux happening? And so that's sort of important in terms of, we set a goal last year, and it's one of those things that's a pretty big stretch. So when we were in discussion last year about what is, could we set a net zero target? What does that even look like? We shifted actually quite last minute, very much due to our president, who I thank regularly for that, both good and bad. We made the commitment to be net zero by 2040. And net zero by 2040, what that means for Chandos is that every building we build in 2040 forward will have a zero carbon footprint, whether our clients ask for it or not. So as of last year, we were calculating greenhouse gas emissions on our kind of operations footprint, scope 1, 2, and some of 3. But I think the thing that as a construction company, you start to have to grapple with when you are calculating greenhouse gas emissions. So again, for just a quick, scope 1 being anything that you burn, like gas, diesel, propane, natural gas, and then scope 2 electricity, and then scope 3 is sort of all of that like supply chain stuff, including other things like commuting, flights, hotels. And then, so if you're a construction company, really, does that, the question to think about is, if we're a general contractor, does our scope 3 include all of the footprint of our trades that are working on our job sites and those projects, those buildings? And I think most people would sort of say that's impossible to do or even to imagine. And how much control do you have as a general contractor over that scope, some of that scope 3 stuff? You don't put in the specifications what kind of, brick to use or what kind of concrete. And so I think that's something that we sort of said, well, we think we can have a positive influence on that. We don't totally know how we're getting there, but we're going to figure it out. We're going to set this really like audacious goal, and we're going to go after it. So that's what our 2040 net zero commitment means. It's not just for our operations. And so that's where we're at. And so when we looked at it, and part of where the conversation came was, we looked and said, okay, so our operations, what we're calculating right now for offices and our job sites was about 5,700 tons. And we're still refining what we're adding into our greenhouse gas emissions calculation there. Like, I'm sure that's going to continue to grow over time, to be honest, because we're still refining methodology around calculating that. But we were around 5,700 tons for 2020. But 2021 looks like it might be a little bit higher because we've started to like include a few more things into that scope 3 space. And again, remembering this is our offices. We have, 7 offices across Canada, and this is our job, including our job sites as well. So that's quite a bear cat to try to track anyway. But when we looked and we said, well, if you look at our supply chain, so how we did a calculation was we said it's easy enough for us to calculate, or it's not easy, but it's more straightforward for us to calculate our own footprint. But if you were to, we did some math on kind of a cost, or if you looked per square foot of greenhouse gas emissions, there's some data out there that shows that. We translated that and looked at it from a cost standpoint and said, okay, so if we can translate to about 363 tons of CO2 per $1 million of project. That's the kind of the GOAT math we've used right now. So again, this math will have to get refined over time. But if you look at what the greenhouse gas emissions are like of our supply chain versus our operations, there's huge opportunity. And that is the embodied carbon piece of that 157,000 tons is the embodied carbon of the materials going in our buildings. So this is, we kind of said, this is really like, that's a huge number. We need to focus on that too. So it's an and also. So let's look at our operations, but let's also look at our buildings and see what impact we can have. So, this idea that if 39% of global greenhouse gas emissions are coming from buildings, we know this number, and energy use is something that a lot more of our, that's been focused on for a lot more years, and it's important and it will continue to be focused on. But the embodied carbon piece is a piece that has been, as Alistair mentioned, a little bit less focused on up to now. And we think that, so if we make it part of our footprint, we can certainly try to have a lot more of a positive influence on where that goes over time. So really, this is the space that we're going to live in with our projects. And I mean, to be honest, we're already doing waste diversion in other space. If you look at the back half of end of life demolition, and we would like to start thinking about, when you think circular economy stuff, how can we start to, think about buildings as material banks and reusing stuff as we can. So this isn't just hey, we're only focused over here. We are focused on the back half of this. Probably the one piece that we're less focused on is just that operating piece, because we really don't have control over that in the same way. So what can we do on this front half and also continue to work on the demolition and the waste diversion piece? So while the world is sort of up and changing right now, I mean, there's electrification of larger pieces of equipment that's happening, and that's going to continue to happen over the next years. We can see this, we can see it coming. We can see that, in the cement industry, there's a lot of work happening and innovation trying to, since we know cement is a massive contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. I think they say it's something like concrete is like 7% of the world's emissions. It's a huge problem we need and opportunity for us to solve. It's one of the most pervasive materials next to water being used across the world. And so innovation's happening in this space. It's happening in electrification of material or in equipment. We're seeing some, impressive changes starting to happen in steel industry, reducing and lowering carbon of that process. It's very energy intensive. That's changing all the time, as in, some of the technology. And again, as the grids green up, we'll start to see, some more changes for those buildings. And then, mass timber, we're seeing that a little bit more. So at the end of the day, and then you have, of course, the embodied carbon that is embedded. You have the embedded carbon in the timber as you're putting that into your building. So really, from a motivation standpoint, just to kind of wrap that piece up, it really fit well in with our B Corp, standing. When we looked at this analysis of carbon from what impact we have, there's a huge impact on the supply chain, and we felt like it would be a great thing for us to kind of take some responsibility for that and see what we could do. I think that this is some stuff that can be a bit strategically differentiating as a company. So I think that's something to consider. And then, lastly, the world is moving in this direction, and sort of the whole cliche Wayne Gretzky skate to where the puck is going, not where it is. This is where the world's going. So we need to get our heads in the game and start understanding embodied carbon so that we can be, we can be doing the right things on our projects, and working more and more with owners and groups who are wanting to design and build in this way and wanting projects. And it's hard to imagine that most projects aren't going to be moving in this direction anyway. So strategically, it makes all kinds of sense to try to get ahead of all of that. So all of that said, that's kind of why and how we are where we are, still figuring a lot of the pieces out. So some of this year really was like, how do we figure this out? Where are we going? So from a process and tracking standpoint, one of the focuses we had this year was to, we got a license for one-click LCA. we kind of felt like if we don't understand the embodied carbon piece, you kind of need to see it, manage what you measure. So we need to see it and understand it so we can start to see what are the impacts that we can have as a contractor. Let's just take some baby steps forward and figure some of these pieces out over the next year or so. So again, we're literally less than a year into our process. So we've analyzed a couple of projects on one-click LCA, starting to think about where are some of the, if we could have some low-hanging fruit that we can start with, what does that look like? And so, one of the things that most people who've been looking at embodied carbon know is, insulation, for example. So like XPS is one of the higher embodied carbon. And, this conversation is complex because insulation in particular, because you might start to say, well, something has higher embodied carbon built into it, but it might actually have better insulating properties and you might need less of it in the construction phase. So what does that look like? When you think about something like rock wool, they're both not recyclable. So what is sort of better environmentally? But at the end of the day, when you look and you start to put this data into like one click, what starts to pop out is that, and there's certainly different options in each of these categories that will be greener than others. Generally, like a rock wool product is lower in embodied carbon from some of our research. And again, there's other options in here. So it's about really not having just set standards saying, well, everything should go rock wool, but, making sure that we do the analysis and figuring out both from a constructability and costing standpoint, what's the best option? What's the either no or low cost option that we can use that has the best, embodied carbon. And that's kind of where we've been focused. So this is one space that we've been looking at. And of course, concrete is something else that we can have fairly substantial influence on in terms of just asking the right questions. So another process that we've been implementing, starting to work on, but again, we haven't been able to roll it out fully yet, is building like a concrete carbon checklist. So, our teams can, when we're in the pre-construction phase, as we're talking with our concrete supplier and structural engineer, can we ask these questions around, optimizing the mix design, what's the lowest embodied carbon concrete can we get with, and there are options that are no cost. So can we do that every time as a low hanging fruit? And then as we start to get into some potential cost premiums, what are those? What does that look like? And so, because we also want to signal to manufacturers that we want them continuing to do the work they're doing because we're going to buy it. So this is a space where we're also moving. And we want to have these checklists for things like steel, concrete, insulation. At bare minimum, we actually have them built already. So that's, this is some of the work we're doing right now. It's the low hanging fruit stuff. And then if we do have projects that are saying, yeah, we want to pay premiums, we can do all the free stuff first and then figure out what is the right kind of premium to go in whatever direction. So that's that piece. Now this kind of leads into a bit of like, where are some of the challenges? And so I'll just kind of summarize, here's some of the stuff that we're doing right now, but we have a long ways to go still to get so this is really rolled out regularly. So we have a goal of 75% waste diversion across the company. We've been pretty successful hitting that. It actually looks like this year we're going to not hit that mark this year. We'll be lower than that. Unfortunately, we've got a lot of projects that are working in smaller communities that don't have access to a lot of recycling. So we're working on that place. We are doing greenhouse gas tracking for office and field. Again, refining our methodology around that and making sure we have everything included. So you can imagine if you've got, 80 over 100 sites in a course of a year, trying to track this stuff it's a massive job. And so that would be kind of a don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Like you can't always get everything right down to the, so what's the right level of tracking? We are doing some reduction measures like LED lighting replacements, purchasing hybrid vehicles. We're looking at some electrification of some of, equipment and what that could look like going forward. Indoor air quality plans and inspections and ESC across job sites, and then starting work with supply chain so we can signal to them, hey, this is the direction we're going. And then key challenges for us, what really can we do as a general contractor versus other stakeholders? The tracking of sites, as I mentioned, huge challenge. Just having a knowledgeable supply chain, like things like our trade partners across the country, understanding where we're going, why, how. And I would say like the consistent calculation techniques, there's a ton out there right now on the embodied carbon side. Like, what are you including? What's in the box of that embodied carbon calculation? Is it just structure? Is it substructure? Is it including some finishes? What is, there's some standards out there, but it's not done consistently across the board. So it's trying to get some apples to apples comparisons there. Our ability to actually make material choices and changes as a general contractor, depending on the project type. And then I think training is a huge issue, because we're going to need across our company to make sure our estimators, our project managers understand the questions they need to be asking when they kick off projects. So I think, we're in a space right now where we've sort of said, hey, let's just start the work. Let's get going, on some of these things. We have a bunch of information to gather, and we can't really make huge changes until we understand where we're at. And it's sort of a slow plodding path forward up to a really big audacious goal. So I will pause there and pass it back to Elster and to Elston.
Thank you, Jen. I'm going to invite people to sort of, send in their questions if you have any. Jen, thank you for that. And I'm going to hand it over to Mark and Denise. Go ahead, guys.
Oh, sorry about that. I turned on the screen sharing and then I suddenly lost how to unmute and change my video. So give me 1 second. There we go. Thanks about that. And so, yeah, no, it was really interesting hearing Jen speak and where Chandos is at as well. I think we're kind of similarly, we'll dive into a bit of where we're at with Ellisdon's journey, what our drivers are, and specifically why embodied carbon matters to us, and then also kind of similarly what we see our role being there and what we're doing already. So very briefly, Ellisdon is like a global construction services company, even though kind of like our prime focus area, and I think what we're primarily known for is construction. We understand that the industry is changing, and we actually have like a whole range of services to kind of address this more holistically. So we can take projects from inception to completion, and even looking at long-term maintenance and operation. So kind of to the kind of like changing construction industry that we're seeing, there is kind of tremendous growth and opportunity happening in our industry. I think for those of you in Toronto or in many other cities, you just kind of have to walk around and you see the plethora of cranes in the sky, or the getting stuck in traffic because of construction sites. So with that big opportunity and with all of that growth comes a lot of responsibility as well. So we need to consider the world that we're living in and that we're operating in as we're going through this growth. Jen already mentioned buildings and infrastructure represent kind of almost 40%, of global emissions. And when we're combining our operational emissions and the emissions from the embodied carbon of materials. So that's definitely a big area of focus for us. So we're increasingly kind of seeing messages from across the industry to not only measure our emissions, but also be accountable for reductions. So in practice, we're seeing this message through regulation. Increasingly, there's kind of plans and requirements around embodied carbon disclosure and reductions as well, specifically at the federal government and the municipality level. So thinking of the City of Vancouver, City of Toronto, City of Edmonton is looking at it for their public buildings as well. And then we're also seeing it in client demand. So clients have their own net zero targets, and more companies are recognizing that that means being accountable, not just for your own operations, but also for your scope 3. So for us as a contractor, that means that we're increasingly seeing requirements and also conversations around not just our own operations, but the embodied carbon as well in our material selection. And then quite practically, we're seeing it in talent retention and recruitment as well. So our kind of current and potential future colleagues are often asking us at least what we're doing in this space. They're looking to work for a responsible company and they want to make an impact in their work as well. So what does that mean practically that we're doing at Ellisdon? So we see this opportunity and we see that there's actions to take at all of these different levels. So when it comes to our own operations, we are holding ourselves accountable. So we're calculating our own emissions, we are setting targets, and we're doing this through the Science Based Targets Initiative to make sure that our targets are stringent and ambitious enough. And then we're also working with our supply chain. So we're trying to build that internal knowledge on embodied carbon and life cycle analysis. We're working with our suppliers to understand what low carbon options are out there and what kind of drivers and constraints they may be facing. And we're also working on building that accountability. So we're working with our subtrades and our vendors to collect our emissions and materials data. What that means in practice is that we have included in our standard contract language that kind of like the request for subtrades to disclose their energy and fuel usage and delivery trips, as well as a request for product-specific environmental product declarations. This is not only to kind of like inform our own processes and reduction strategies, but also really to kind of promote that data transparency and facilitate kind of filling that gap that we currently see in the market. We're also working with our clients, specifically those that are looking to us for guidance on kind of practical and low carbon solutions. And we're helping them identify what low carbon means for them and what kind of solutions kind of fit with their potential costs and schedule limitations. And then kind of more broadly with the wider industry, we're committed to kind of like openness and collaboration and really want to help move the industry as a whole forward and help with that education and kind of like data transparency piece as well. So whether that is through kind of like webinars like this or participation in kind of boards and committees, or just generally kind of like publication of our emissions data. So in practice for Ellis Don, our commitment is net zero by 2050 with an interim target of 42% reduction by 2030. So that's going to be less than a decade. And that's kind of similar to Chandler's. It doesn't just include our own operations, but it includes our value chain as well. We've submitted to science-based targets. We're working to get to work through that validation progress, but that shouldn't really affect what are actually the stringency of our targets. Like we'll likely be sticking with those numbers. In practice, like what does that actually mean for Ellis-Don, or like what do our emissions look like at this time? So when we're looking at our direct activities, so our scope 1 and scope 2, they're currently equal to over 10,000 passenger vehicles driven in a year. And kind of like despite providing different services, our emissions are still dominated by our construction sites, specifically looking at our fuel and natural gas usage on sites. So our construction site emissions make up more than 80% of our total emissions when we're looking at our direct activities. When we're looking at our overall emissions profile, so kind of capturing all categories outlined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, we're closer to 3 megatons of CO2. So that's kind of about 750,000 passenger vehicles driven in a year, or kind of 0.4% of Canada's total emissions. If we're looking at that, our own operations are really only about 1% of that total emissions profile, with the vast majority of our emissions actually coming from the operations of the buildings that we're building, as well as the embodied carbon of our building materials. So this picture isn't necessarily a surprise to us. I think we were expecting to see that our scope 3 emissions would be the bigger piece of the pie, but it does really highlight how we need to not only kind of like decarbonize our own operations, but really support the market in moving towards low carbon and help kind of push those drivers. So kind of in short, like we're seeing the opportunity and the responsibility to decarbonize in our industry. And we want to, as a company, lead in this space, but we know we can't do it alone and that it needs to be an industry-wide collaboration, with one of the big focus areas for us really being the emissions that come from our materials, primarily because it is such a big driver of our emissions as well. So I'll hand it over to Mark to kind of speak to what we're currently doing in this space and what we see our role being.
Great, thanks, Denise. So yeah, I mean, I wanted to start with this slide kind of showing 2 Ellis-Don logos, basically. You know, there's the Sustainable Building Solutions team. That's kind of, Denise is one of the leaders on that team, and I lead one of the construction science, part of the construction science division. And the construction sciences division, I want to just highlight, it's kind of like the internal R&D material expertise of this company. And it really kind of takes both of these groups to come together to not only like set us on the right trajectory, but actually get us there in practice. So we kind of have concrete experts, steel experts, glazing experts, all that kind of stuff. And what I want to talk about today is like kind of the steps we're taking to tackle some of the actual, like, you know, this is coming down to embodied carbon. And it's a material sciences problem oftentimes in the end. So we'll dig through a little bit of what we've been up to there. So maybe jump to the next slide, please. And so, you know, I don't know, this was maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, we set off on this kind of embodied carbon journey. We formed a working group with these two departments. Obviously, the structure sticks out as a, you know, a pretty heavy emitter. So we'll talk a bit about what we're doing and acting on those kind of three big material groups. And we're also starting to really dig into, you know, envelope. There's some interesting things to think about, but interiors is an interesting space. You know, Elliston puts a lot of work into the commercial office sector as an example. And, you know, all the interiors is kind of like one of the minority shares of this pie. You know, you can quickly see how if you are cycling through your interiors on like a tenant improvement basis every 10 years, 5 years, whatever, you're basically just replicating that piece of the pie, and it becomes increasingly more important. So although kind of on the first go around, it represents a small portion, you know, as we tackle the structure and we move on, it's becoming something that we're paying a lot close attention to. So maybe just starting off with concrete. The way we approach kind of every material first is like understanding what the world's doing here. You know, there's tons of research going into different types of technologies. You know, some of them are real, some of them are like here today, some of them are 5 years out, some of them are moonshots, like breakthrough things. And you really have to assess like, kind of make sense of all of that and understand like what is implementable today within the Canadian market or within like the greater Vancouver area market and all of the kind of costs associated with it. So, you know, how we kind of simplify it in our heads is we kind of start putting things into buckets. And so there's like a big area of focus is on cement reduction, and that's us focusing in on which suppliers can use PLCs and different types of SCMs. There was a bunch of questions in the chat about the how you specify these things, and that's actually a crucial step in order to achieve cement replacement. And so, you know, our material sciences team is in these big jobs, understanding, optimizing the mix design alongside the suppliers, which a lot of the time is the incentives are aligned to do that with performance. Oftentimes, cement reduction can involve, you know, different types of higher performances and low carbon. So you kind of get two things at once. So the cement reduction is a big area of focus for us, as well as next one over, structural optimization is an interesting piece. You know, we're getting more and more into different types of design, build, and integrated project delivery models, where we're at the seat for the planning phases. And again, this is an interesting area where the incentives are quite aligned, where, you know, the incentives are often for like high efficiency buildings, high efficiency processes in these contract models, which results in like, you know, us trying to figure out ways to get rid of transfer slabs, trying to optimize space planning. And we're kind of coming up with strategies to do that on a more broad basis. So element sizes, high early mixes, you know, we're looking at a lot of things there on the optimization front. And then sequestration is, you know, this is where a lot of like kind of more startup companies are entering the space. How do you actually utilize the carbon back into the structure? So we kind of mapped out that in a lot of detail and implementing this out on our sites today. Let me jump to the next slide here. So, you know, another interesting thing is these are all independent strategies, but what we try to do is stack these. You know, they're independent strategies, but they can easily be stacked on certain projects. So you can optimize your structure and reduce cement and sequester simultaneously on specific types of projects. And it takes some like material expertise to make sure you're not messing up the performance or the working properties of the mix when you do so. But that's kind of how you know one of these strategies is enough to achieve the targets that us or any contractor is setting. And so you kind of have to stack if you want to be able to kind of achieve some deep reductions. Next slide, please. And just an example of a job where, you know, we have done this, you know, when we built the Eglinton LRT, I know for those in Toronto, they'd be grumbling because it's not open yet, but I can show you the concrete's been done for a little while. And we went up to 70% cement replacement on this job. And again, about the incentives, like we needed to, these are all mass concrete elements. You want to go cement replacement anyways to reduce the heat of hydration, to reduce thermal cracking and differentials and things like that. But it has the downstream benefit and the immediate benefit of avoiding a significant amount of CO2. Like 130,000 tons is quite significant. That's on one large project. So it's kind of a glimpse in the steel world. Moving on, or sorry, that's kind of what we're up to concrete. Moving on to steel. Those of you familiar with like the purchasing of steel, it's quite a fragmented industry. And so we're often 1, 2, or even 3 steps away from the producers. And, this complexity, makes it difficult for us as a contractor to enact direct change sometimes, because there's manufacturers involved and there's often brokerages as well. So that complexity makes it difficult, but what we have done is kind of, we're in a data collection stage really with steel. If we jump to the next slide, we're kind of all of the steel suppliers we deal with, we're trying to come up with product specific EPDs. If you jump to the next slide, we're also starting to understand the variation in carbon as it relates to the shape of the steel. Different shapes of steel have different structural properties, but they also have different carbon properties. And, all things considered, you can actually make some significant savings on carbon by altering the shapes, as long as you're not having to add a hell of a lot more of it. So, which we've done with some success on some projects. Maybe next slide, please. And in terms of, again, some big buckets that we can target in our efforts on in the steel world. There's the manufacturing processes, of course. There's different types of furnaces that you can make steel in. And by specifying things in a certain way, you can kind of push the sourcing to come from the more sustainable options of furnace, either like the electric arcs or like the electric arc supplemented with the DRI. The location that you source from matters quite a bit just due to electrical grid. So on a project level, you can have some success making kind of some double-digit reductions in the steel embodied carbon. Though at an industry level, it becomes more challenging because everyone can't buy steel from the one particular mill that is producing it a little bit more efficiently. However, all we're doing is sending kind of continuous market signals to those who have electric arc, who have decarbonized electrical grids. And I'll point out the second bucket, the structural optimization, is another unique thing. Obviously, we're trying to use as less steel as possible in our structures, just for like cost optimization reasons. But you can get in some interesting conversations about things like high strength steel. So using less tonnage of steel, but it is higher strength. It actually yields a carbon benefit overall. And although it's honestly, if you're smart about it in your design, you can actually get it pretty much cost neutral. And so you've achieved a carbon benefit with a reduced tonnage by just going high strength. You can apply the same to rebar. And it gets interesting that the lap lengths have to get a bit longer, but you can still there's pathways. Again, this is why we have like the technical building sciences group here to help navigate that complexity on like the hundreds of sites across the country. And I'll jump to mass timber. And we're like everyone else, we're building a lot of big mass timber buildings now. And kind of our areas of focus in there, we get a lot of questions about certifications. What role do certifications of the wood play in embodied carbon? If you buy a certification A, B, or C, does that change its direct embodied carbon? So we've done some studies on that. We're working closely with some researchers out in Vancouver to understand it a little bit better. What decision making do we have to make early on? One thing I'll point out is that, there's optimization on all structural materials, certainly concrete and steel, we talked about that a little bit, but, a 30 by 30 mass timber grid can be designed in like a very efficient manner or a less efficient manner. And so even though materially maybe we're gaining something on the carbon front by going with mass timber, if you're using maybe 20% too much mass timber just because it's like not the greatest design, or there's some specific requirement pushing you in that direction, you kind of immediately lose your carbon benefit. So we're focusing on the structural components, how deep they are, the optimization of the grids, and of course the transportation. You know, whether we're trucking it from out west or we're putting on a boat from Europe, those have different and sometimes not intuitive outcomes on the carbon front. And so just like, you know, Jen was talking about using softwares to understand the embodied carbon, we're kind of building up those cases for different materials and different kind of routes to the site as well. So yeah, maybe we'll just finish on a couple challenges and lessons learned. You know, we've come across similar gaps in the available data. We have a hard time kind of pulling product-specific information from certain aspects of the supply chain. But you know, I think that the tides have certainly shifted in the last 2-3 years, where the data is becoming more available, and so we're kind of shifting from like a data collection mode into like an implementation of changes mode. So like we know how much the embodied carbon is in a certain mix design, but we can actually impact that directly now, and make some changes. On the life cycle assessment front, you know, it's often been used on our projects as like a reporting tool. We design a whole building, it kind of goes through IFC drawings. Then we do a life cycle assessment to see how we did, which is not a great tool for decision making. And so we're kind of pushing the LCA work. We're front end loading it significantly, and as a result, going more iteratively through them, from schematics through construction drawings, so we can actually make decisions based on embodied carbon rather than kind of just reporting where we ended up. We talked a lot about material reduction and how the you know, that's a good thing for cost. It's also a great thing for carbon. The cascading impacts become interesting in a lot of these buildings when you start making shifts. You know, whether you say like, okay, we're going to go to 75% cement replacement on this job. But I mean, there's that might be great. Maybe you get a good embodied carbon number off the hop, but understanding the things that cascade out of that, like you know, that's going to impact the time of stripping of that certain mix. It's going to fly in the face of a high early, if you desire high early strength, it'll impact all these little nitty gritty things that, you know, the carbon is one factor in quite honestly quite a complex industry. So we have to make sure we're not inadvertently kind of changing something else. And the same goes for you know, when we're performing LCAs. If we swap a building to mass timber, that's great potentially, but there's several cascading impacts from that. You know, it's going to, which maybe are favorable, maybe are less favorable. You know, you're going to end up with lighter foundations, less finishes, things like that. So like we have kind of maps of all of these different cascading impacts, so we don't kind of inadvertently advertise we're doing something, but then a result on site, we need high strength, so we just buy high early anyways, which means we have a ton more cement. So we want to understand that what we're doing is actually like translating in real value to our clients on the embodied carbon front, and it's not just like, you know, a thing we put in the proposal up front. And that's honestly, it gets very detailed very quickly, and you know, we're just going to kind of see more and more of it over time. But I mean, Denise, you can
yeah, I just wanted to point, sorry, on the last 2 points there, where it's kind of like it's about carbon accounting or decarbonization in general as well, where it's like working on our internal tracking processes. I think like everyone is pretty aware there's a lot of different data that comes into this picture, and like to make kind of founded reduction strategies, but also to be able to monitor that you're actually having the effect and impact that you want to have. And I think what we're trying to do, at least when it comes to tracking this data, is making it an expansion of our current processes versus having completely separate processes, because obviously there's a lot of different data tracking that comes into it. So if we're already tracking materials in a certain way, can we leverage that department or that tracking to then just add the carbon to that? I think it's quite, I mean, it's quite self-explanatory, but at the same time very challenging, just because there is a lot of kind of change management that also comes of that in the cases where we maybe not are, or we aren't tracking the data to that extent or to the granularity that we would like. And then kind of finally, it's like kind of like the common thread throughout this is like just that collaboration is key. Like if we're trying to decarbonize the industry, we need to decarbonize materials. We need to decarbonize like the building operations. Like we for sure have a role to play as a contractor, but we can't do it without one, information from others, and two, having others that are committed as well. I think that's what we just kind of wanted to end with. And then I'll pass it back to Alistair.
Wonderful. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jen. We've had a flurry of questions that I can start going through. But I'll kind of just, in summary, I think, there's so much to unpack here. And, what I would recommend for those of you who are on the call, who if you don't get through all of your questions, is, reaching out obviously to Denise and Jen and Mark as well. If you have further questions, I think that would definitely be encouraged. But I think, and we'll get into some of these questions here, but I think I wanted to highlight a couple of things. I think we've seen two very different approaches that are very complementary in sort of how both Elliston and Chandos have come into this arena. There's sort of the approach of analysis, which is common to both, of setting sort of real science-based targets. There's a lot of emphasis on training and talent, which I think is such a huge, perhaps a challenge sometimes, especially within the design industry. We're sort of trying to find talent that understand LCAs, that understand carbon isn't always as easy. We end up bringing in people from overseas quite often, actually, on the design side of things. And so I think developing that talent is kind of really an important piece. And the other one I think is, I think both practices have talked a lot about collaboration, and that's collaboration between themselves and their trades, but also I think in coming to the table early, which really talks about policy, which talks about procurement, which talks about the delivery models. Moving into more collaborative delivery models seems to be a common thread between both organizations, so that they can affect the decision-making process along the way. I think everyone here on the call will probably agree that the earlier you can get some of this LCA information into a project, the better it is from both an efficiency and a cost perspective. So I'm going to jump into some questions here. Thank you for all of you who have put these questions in. Right off the bat, there was a question about electric construction equipment. I actually haven't seen this yet. Are you guys seeing this in Elliston and Chandos? Have you seen this on site yet?
You want to go ahead, Mark?
Well, yeah, I guess like the quick answer is our tower cranes have always been electric, full electric tower cranes, but the photos of like the people, what they're doing over in Europe, we haven't implemented that at all on our sites just yet. I think like honestly, we don't actually own much of that equipment ourselves either. So,
right.
Yeah, so to be more specific, I say our subcontractors haven't implemented too much of it just yet. It's a good question though. I actually don't know if they even own it.
Yeah, I would agree. We own a lot more small equipment. We don't own like the big excavator stuff.
Right.
But that is coming. So it's that was a picture from Europe. It's coming. We're going to see more, but it is our subcontractors who have most of the larger equipment, and we will be starting to look at electrifying any of the smaller stuff we might have, like skid steers and some of that stuff as that starts to roll out. But we haven't been able to. We just see that that's where it's going, like it's coming. So.
Mm-hmm. I think to that as well, just to briefly add, I think it's definitely something that we are exploring. I think with that comes challenges, like it depends on like the project type, project location as well. For example, if we're looking at a civil project that might be quite rural or that might not get that temporary power connection either, it's maybe not as beneficial to go down the electric equipment route at that time, because if we're using a kind of a diesel fuel generator to generate the electricity for that equipment, it's not really as beneficial for us either. So it's definitely something we're exploring. I think there is application opportunities for it, but we also need to kind of like work through some of the kinks that are currently there for some of our projects as well.
Yeah, and Denise, like one interesting thing, correct me if I'm wrong, but like a big chunk of our own emissions is actually like less so about the equipment and more so about like us heating these buildings in the wintertime, like winter heat. And so then, there's not much precedent for like electric winter heat of construction sites either. It's a lot of it's gas fired. And so that's like a frontier that we have to figure out how to tackle. That's actually like a bigger impact than our trucks and stuff.
Yeah, I would say we're like digging into that further as well. And I think winter heating is definitely a big aspect of it. It's interesting as well there, where it's like we're trying to, on like one project, we are going to kind of trial electric winter heating. Granted that it's in a location with a very clean grid, so that helps as well. But I think, so yeah, I think the short answer to that is we're trying a lot of different things.
Trying to figure it out, yeah.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. There's some questions from Forrest Hutton Burnaby. So we have, with costs in mind, what are you finding for low carbon concrete? Are there green premiums, and what are the low hanging fruit? Mark, maybe you want to start with that one, and then we can jump around the others. They're just, I guess, asking about low carbon concrete. Like, I know we've seen sort of greener specs, base specs come out here. Is that something you're seeing across the board?
And you say from Burnaby?
Yeah, this is Forrest.
This is Forrest. From Burnaby.
Yeah,
I mean, that's interesting. We've studied the Vancouver and surrounding area market quite a bit. So like whether you go to Burnco, Lafarge, Ocean, all the big ready mix suppliers out there, they all have, honestly, their baseline mix, like Jen was saying, some of these things don't cost money. The baseline mix from a lot of these people incorporates some element. There's no magic in the concrete world, right? Like what they're doing is cement replacement using PLC cements and using different types of SUNs. There's like nothing else really going on, except maybe some people use carbon cure, but not too many just yet. So like all the suppliers, all they're doing is like a ratio of implementing those three things. And so that's when you go from like the base to their low carbon to their prime mixes is just them implementing and optimizing further and further and further. And so we definitely do see a green premium. It's like less significant than, it's not like double the cost. Like an example would be, a normal mix with the 30 MPa would cost like $180 a meter versus the low carbon one would cost 235 or something. So it's not like double, but we're seeing like probably like 15-20% premiums. The one thing I will mention is that there's and it's not recognized enough early on, like you can go for all these the highest performing mixes from a carbon standpoint do carry with them performance impacts. The strength gain is much slower, and so it's not always recognized early on because the incentive on site is like rip the forms out immediately, and so that involves a green premium as well that's not apparent from the ready mix supplier, because we're actually impacting days on our schedule, or we're planning our jobs differently as a result of taking a hit on the concrete strength gain. So the premiums can exist. This is again a cascading impact. The premium exists from the supplier for now. They'll come down over time, and it exists from the contractor if they are sophisticated enough to understand the schedule impacts of it.
Yeah,
so
and I would agree with all of those things. And one thing that's interesting, it might actually bring a bit of Felix's question in on the concrete side or cement side. What's interesting is that idea of what impact government can have when we look at some places. So Mark, you mentioned like BC generally has, already some pretty of that sort of low hanging fruit, lower carbon concrete stuff embedded in. So that like layering of all those pieces, the Portland limestone, all of that. What's interesting is like, I think, so I've heard from, speaking with someone in the Cement Association in Alberta, that like Alberta Transportation still only specifies general use cement in their concrete mix. And so therefore because they do that, it's, got a bit more carbon in it. And so then we have a number of smaller suppliers in Alberta who only supply, they don't have Portland limestone cement in supply because they might be bidding on Alberta transportation work. So therefore, if you use that supplier, you're getting GU cement in your mix no matter what. And so you have limited opportunity to be able to, it's just one kind of low hanging fruit thing that could be done. So governments absolutely. So to that, and in a concrete example, governments absolutely have a huge place to really help move and drive greener policies and help as an industry for us to move forward. There's a lot of leadership there. And when we see some lagging in those spaces, it can have a huge impact on supply and what we're actually able to provide.
Totally. It's an immense frustration. You know, sometimes we do come like up against walls where we want to do better on a carbon and performance standpoint, but we're bound by a certain set of like legacy specifications, and they're difficult to change, but they kind of need to change if we want to advance kind of a lot. And this is like, again, focusing on infrastructure in all provinces. We see some element of that.
A sort of adjunct question, I guess, in terms of the I guess the challenges and lessons learned is approaching, you know, if we're going to assume that you sort of bring in, as part of your scope 3, bring in sort of all of the carbon footprint of your trades and everyone else. How have those conversations gone early on, now that you're both kind of starting on this journey? You know, how has the uptake been in various sort of parts of the country, because you guys do work across the country? How has that been so far, and what are I guess some of the lessons to be learned from that in approaching your subs and their subs, in terms of the kind of data you're looking for, the type of processes, or just you know, from the training side, just appreciating what it is you're trying to do? How has that been so far? Maybe Jen, maybe you can start, and then we'll go to Elistan.
So I say we haven't done a lot with our trades yet. So we've been on sort of our fact finding this year, figuring out where's the spaces we want to spend our time to just get some real motion initially. One of the things that we have created this year but haven't quite sent out is we want to do a sort of dipstick check. So like almost like a small short survey with any of our trades that are working with us, to just ask them about. So we're kind of, our first step will be sort of priming the market. So it won't impact their bidding with us yet, but it'll sort of be, are you doing any of these measures in your business? So that's our first step is and so we would look at that, do that for a couple of years as priming. So they start to see that, oh, this is coming. I can't turn around in 2 years and say, sorry, you can't work with Chandos unless you're doing these things, because we're not there yet. So we need to prime the market, and manufacturers are well ahead of the game. It's kind of, it's more on I would say the GC and the trade part in terms of, and we've got designers who are and starting to figure out what they want to try to specify, but they're stuck because they always have to have at least 3 options for each thing. And so then we have this gap. And I think, Mark, you kind of mentioned there's just almost like a gap right now on the construction side in terms of our ability to link up what's happening on the manufacturer with what's happening on our construction and what is being specified. And so, yeah, collaboration, but so we're not quite there yet. We're going to be sending out that kind of I think a survey starts to work and get people thinking about, or maybe it comes in when they have to, every time they submit a bill or start a project with us, they would answer some kind of sustainability survey. So we're sort of still figuring what that looks like, just so that we can start to grow the knowledge in the market that that's where we're headed.
Fabulous. Denise, Mark?
Yeah, I think to that, we're at like a relatively similar side, but we are starting to implement it on certain things. So I think we have some kind of like pre-qualification questions in our general kind of questionnaire to sub-trades that are specifically on sustainability or ESG in general. So I think that really speaks to that kind of education piece as well, because I think it's a similar path to what a lot of GCs likely have walked as well, where it's like we increasingly started getting these questions from our clients, and then besides kind of like the internal drive, that also helped drive us kind of trying to get that data together so we're better able to answer those questions too. So I think there's that side. Then there is, so we do have it in our standard contract language. We don't enforce it on all projects. So sorry, in our general contract language that we can request for that data when it comes to kind of fuel usage or delivery trip specifically, as well as EPDs. We are working on specific pilot projects where we are really tracking that data. We are working with our subs to get that data. I would say there that the initial response is sometimes a bit hit and miss. I think there is some kind of like initial hesitation or reluctance but that primarily comes, I think, from a lack of understanding of what it actually means or what it is that we're asking from them. So we've developed certain templates that basically lay out where it's like, hey, just on a monthly basis, when you submit your invoices, also just submit how much fuel you've used or how many delivery trips you've taken and what your distance is. We'll do the calculations on our side. This is just a base information that we require. And I would say on all of our pilot projects, after those initial kind of conversations, it's not been as much of an issue. So I think it kind of speaks to Jen's point. It is that education piece where it's like, okay, so we are starting to ask these questions. We're actually starting to ask for the data kind of across the country on select projects, and we're hoping to build it out from there.
That's great. Thanks, Denise. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Jen, for answering those questions. And we are at the hour, so I am going to unfortunately have to wrap this up. This is great. I mean, I think this is a conversation we can keep going for days, and I think it's one I think we should in so many other ways. A last thing I will ask, I guess, is are there plans to share some of these learnings, through sort of your own sort of company publications, etc. Because I think you have a captive audience. I think we're all trying to sort of learn, whether we're clients, designers, contractors, suppliers, it doesn't matter. We're all trying to collectively learn, and we love that you were willing to do this and willing to share your experiences thus far. But I think continuing to do so would have massive impact, I think, to the industry. So yeah, that would be perhaps my last question. Maybe is how do you plan on sharing further learnings? I was thinking maybe we could make this a bit of a returning panel. Maybe we do this every year, invite others, wherever they are in their journey, and get a larger conversation going. But yeah, immense gratitude. Thank you so much. I'll let you guys answer the question, and then I'll pull the plug. Go ahead.
Sure.
I guess I can start. So just we're in the process of, we're trying to visualize a lot of our data with sort of like a reporting dashboard that's nice and easy. I don't want to produce like I don't have to, we're employee owned company, so I don't have to produce a 100-page sustainability report. So what we'd like to do is have really strong data visualization in a dashboard that would be easy. And so we're actually in the works of doing that on our website right now. So as we start tracking more of this, she'll be able to check back and sort of see what we're doing from a dashboard standpoint, and just sort of see, this is the amount of waste you've generated and created. This is your greenhouse gases, like really quick tidbits so that it's easy to see. So that is evolving and happening right now.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say a couple things. I mean, we've actually already started. We go around to all our clients and give like the 1.5-hour long version of like what you should do for concrete specifically, if anyone is interested in that, in steel and timber as well. I think we've also published, at least internally, we published a bunch of reports on concrete, like as we're diving through the material specifics. And Denise, you probably have more of the corporate perspective on what we're doing.
Yeah, I would say from a corporate perspective, we're definitely interested in that sharing and data transparency piece. So we'll be publishing our emissions on an annual basis. We've just gone through like the first year of like tracking that emissions. So that report will be coming out in kind of like early next year. So there definitely is the intent to share kind of like where we're at data wise, and also kind of more on the education piece of how we got to that data. Because I think everyone is trying to figure it out. Everyone is trying to figure out what data to include or to how to get that to that data. Our value chain is sometimes quite interesting to try and figure out where the data is coming from, or even like if it's out there already. So we're definitely interested in kind of in sharing that. And also if anyone wants to have further conversations on that, we're open to that as well.
Fabulous. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, Alistair.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.